I only receive one item. The lawyer said it while my 2 children were quietly laughing, and that laughter rang louder than my own heartbeat. On the table, in front of them, was ownership of my husband's corporation, worth more than $48 million. And in front of me, there was only an old phone, locked with a password. Before I could even ask anything, my eldest son shrugged. Guess Dad left it for Mom as a keepsake. I stood up, my hands trembling as I picked up that ice-cold phone, and in that exact moment I decided I would not cry, I would not beg, and I would not explain myself. Because if this was the only thing he left me, then it had to contain something they didn't know. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like, so it can reach even further. My name is Audrey White. That year, I was 67 years old, and the man who had just been divided up like a balance sheet, Richard White, had been my husband for more than 40 years. Richard was a name that made people stand up to shake hands at real estate gatherings across California. He built his empire from nothing, from empty lots along the highway to commercial projects stretching across the West Coast. People called him the man who never lost. And me? I was called his wife. I had been used to the world seeing me as an accessory for a very long time, but I never thought that even after he died, I would still be nothing more than a tiny footnote at the bottom of his will. The will reading took place at the offices of Whitman and Cole, on the 21st floor of a glass building in the middle of downtown. The conference room was large and cold, the fluorescent lights so white they made everyone's skin look paler than usual. I sat at the head of the table, my back straight, my hands folded neatly on my lap. I wore the simplest black dress I owned, no jewelry, no perfume. I didn't want to look like a widow waiting to be pitied. Evan and Lauren sat across from me. My eldest son, Evan White, leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, his phone placed neatly by his right hand. He looked exactly like Richard, from the bridge of his nose to that confident furrow in his brow. Lauren was different. She always knew how to present herself properly. Softly curled hair, an expensive black dress, her handbag placed carefully beside her chair. She didn't look at me. From the very beginning, her eyes stayed fixed on the folder in front of the lawyer. When the lawyer reached the asset distribution section, I heard each number drop onto the table like cold stones. 40% of the company shares to Evan, 35% along with ownership of the main estate to Lauren. The remaining portion divided among vacation properties, vintage cars, and investment portfolios. They nodded. They exchanged quick, subtle glances. But I noticed those were the looks of people who already knew the outcome and were simply waiting for the process to finish. I stayed still. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I had lived beside Richard long enough to understand one thing. He never did anything without purpose. If he made me wait, then waiting was what I needed to do. Until the lawyer cleared his throat and turned to the final page. And for my wife, Audrey White. In that moment, I heard my heartbeat clearly. Not because I expected money. I was no longer young enough to dream about numbers. But after 40 years together, I believed I deserved at least an explanation. The lawyer paused briefly, as if even he found this part uncomfortable. I leave one item only, my personal phone, stored in the safe in my private office, with one mandatory condition. It must not be forced open by any means. Then silence. 1 second, 2 seconds. And then Evan laughed first. Not a loud laugh, but a short, quiet one, sharp with mockery. Lauren covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking slightly. I looked at them, and for the first time in my life, I saw it clearly. In their eyes, I wasn't their mother. I was excess detail. "It's just a phone," Evan said lightly. Dad really kept his sense of humor to the very end. I didn't respond. I looked at the lawyer instead. He avoided my eyes. "One additional clause," he said quickly, as if trying to wrap things up. "Mrs. Audrey White is permitted to remain in the estate for a period of 30 days, starting today." 30 days. 40 years of marriage, exchanged for 30 days. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because there was nothing left to ask in that room. When the lawyer handed me the safe key, his hand trembled slightly. The key was so small it fit neatly in my palm. I took it, stood up, and felt my children's stares burning into my back. No one asked, "Mom, are you okay?" No one stood up to walk me out. I left the conference room and walked down the long glass hallway. Outside, the city carried on as if a man named Richard White had not just been buried, and as if a woman named Audrey White had not just been erased from her former life. Richard's private office was on the 18th floor, at the far end of the hall. Everything looked exactly as it had on his last day alive. The walnut desk, the unfinished project sketches, the leather chair he always used, the familiar scent of black coffee mixed with old wood. The safe was hidden behind an abstract painting I had never liked. Richard used to call it a long-term investment. I took the painting down and inserted the key. Click. The sound was so small that without paying attention, you might think it was just metal brushing against metal. Inside the safe was exactly one item, the phone. Not a new model, not a sleek smartphone. It was an older one, the plastic edges slightly worn at the corners. I picked it up. Cold. Heavier than I expected. I pressed the power button. The screen lit up. The logo appeared. And then, our wedding photo. I was younger, thinner, my eyes brighter. Richard stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my waist, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed the world already belonged to him. Then the lock screen appeared. 6 empty circles. Password required. I tried our wedding date. Wrong. His birthday. Wrong. Evan's birthday. Wrong. Lauren's birthday. Wrong. Each wrong attempt made the phone vibrate gently, like a polite but firm refusal. I sat down in Richard's chair. The leather creaked softly beneath my weight. I looked at the phone resting in my palm, and for the first time since he died, I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because something deep inside me had just woken up. Richard never made jokes, and he never abandoned anything he considered important. If he left me a locked phone, it wasn't a keepsake. It was a door. And whatever truth waited behind that door, I knew one thing for certain. This phone could not be meaningless. Richard's funeral had taken place 3 days before the will reading, but it wasn't until I walked out of the law office with that cold phone in my hand that I truly returned to that moment, as if my mind needed time to accept reality before allowing the memory to surface. The funeral home was in Pasadena, an elegant place with perfectly trimmed lawns and straight rows of cypress trees leading to the main hall. Everything there was designed to feel solemn, expensive, and emotionally distant. When I walked in that day, the heavy scent of white flowers hit me immediately, turning my stomach. Richard hated flowers. He used to say they were only beautiful for a moment before dying, just like relationships built on appearances. And yet that room was overflowing with flowers, large wreaths, elaborate arrangements, ribbons bearing the names of corporations, partners, and investment funds. All names I recognized, but never truly knew. Richard's coffin sat in the center. dark wood, meticulously polished, expensive enough that I immediately knew Evan had chosen it. My son always believed anything connected to his father had to be worthy. I stood in front of the coffin for a long time, but I didn't step closer. I didn't have the strength to look at that motionless face again. The last image of Richard I carried was of him collapsed over his desk, surrounded by unfinished drawings and contracts, an image I only learned about later, through his secretary. The service began on time. People stood and sat according to the coordinator's cues. Evan and Lauren sat in the front row closest to the aisle. I was placed in the second row, alone. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I waited. I expected someone to come sit beside me, but no one did. Not a hand reached for mine, not a whispered word of concern. I sat there, my back straight, my hands resting on my handbag, feeling like I had taken someone else's seat. I turned to look at Evan. He had his head lowered, but not in prayer. His phone rested on his lap, the screen lighting up constantly. I could clearly see names appear and disappear: lawyer, assistant, chief financial officer, bank. Evan nodded, whispered a few words, then ended the call. Lauren wasn't much different. She held her phone with both hands, fingers moving quickly, her focus so intense I knew she wasn't hearing a single word being spoken at the front. I realized that at their father's funeral, my children were working. The officiant began speaking about Richard White, a brilliant businessman, a philanthropist, a visionary. The words flowed smoothly, polished, carefully edited to avoid touching any sharp edges. No one mentioned that Richard worked 16 hours a day. No one spoke about the nights he sat alone in his office, cold coffee beside him, trying to save a failing project. No one mentioned the chest pains he ignored because the work wasn't finished yet. No one spoke of the man who died alone. I listened with an empty heart. The words weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. They were a beautiful summary written to make listeners feel comfortable, not to tell the truth. I sat there, staring at my husband's coffin, and wondered, if Richard could hear this, what would he think? He would probably smile politely. Richard was always good at that. When it was time for the family to speak, Evan stood up. He spoke briefly and efficiently, thanked the partners, emphasized that the company would continue according to his father's vision. He didn't mention me once. Lauren didn't stand. She simply lowered her head, placed her hand over her chest for a few seconds, a perfect gesture for the cameras. I wasn't invited to speak, and I didn't stand. I didn't believe there was anything I could say in that room without making things uncomfortable. I had grown used to stepping back for far too long. Throughout the service, the phone in my purse felt like a stone. I didn't have it yet, but that sensation, that weight, had appeared early. I remember gripping the strap of my bag tightly, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I thought about Richard, about the last time we spoke. Over the phone, brief, rushed. He said he'd be home late. I said I'd leave dinner in the oven. We didn't say, "I love you." We'd grown used to saving those words for later. Later never came. When the service ended, everyone stood almost at once, as if an invisible signal had been given. Evan was the first to step into the aisle. He didn't look back at the coffin. Lauren followed, answering her phone as she walked. I remained seated for a few more seconds, watching the room slowly empty, the white flowers still standing there, silent and unfamiliar. I stood up last. No one waited for me. In the reception area outside, people gathered in small clusters. I saw handshakes, polite hugs, whispered conversations about stocks, projects, and the transition period. I saw Evan standing at the center of a group, his expression serious but confident. I saw Lauren smiling softly at a woman I didn't know, her eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. No one came to me. I stood beside a small table with coffee and cookies, holding a paper cup I didn't drink from. I felt like a shadow, present but unseen. A few people approached, offering polite condolences. Richard was a great man. You must be very proud. I nodded, smiled appropriately, thanked them. I had done it hundreds of times in my life, smiling when expected, even when empty inside. There was only one moment that truly jolted me awake. I heard Evan speaking with a man near the door. His voice was low, but close enough. Yes, we'll handle everything quickly. There's nothing to worry about. My father prepared everything already. Prepared. That word lodged itself inside me like a thorn. I looked at Evan, at the way he spoke, the way he stood, the way he showed no sign of having just lost his father. And for the first time, I wondered, had my children been waiting for this day longer than I realized? I left the funeral home alone. The parking lot was wide, the sun harsh, everything painfully normal. I got into my car, closed the door, and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. I didn't cry. I had cried enough in the nights before. Now I just felt tired. A deep exhaustion, not of the body, but of realizing I had been standing in the wrong place for far too long. As I drove away, the funeral home faded in the rearview mirror. Richard's funeral ended like a brief meeting. Efficient, emotionless, nothing extra. And I, the woman who had been his wife, had no place in it. That evening, when I returned home, I opened my handbag and looked at the empty space where the phone should have been. At that time, I didn't yet know I would receive it, but a very clear feeling settled in. Something about all of this was wrong. Not because of money, not because of the will, but because everything had unfolded too smoothly, too prepared, as if it had all been rehearsed in advance. I sat in the living room, warm yellow light washing over familiar walls, and thought about Richard, about the things he never said, the things he hid. And I didn't know that just a few days later, an old phone would become the first piece of evidence proving that the funeral that day was not just a farewell. It was the beginning of the truth. I returned to the mansion that afternoon, after the will reading, when the sun had already begun to sink behind the tall rows of palm trees lining the road into the neighborhood. The house was still there. Grand and familiar, just as it had been for more than 40 years. But from the moment I stepped through the iron gate, I felt something deeply different, as if this place no longer belonged to me, even though my name was still on a few documents that hadn't yet been changed. 2 days after the funeral, the lawyer sent an official email. The message was brief, precise, without a single unnecessary word. I was permitted to continue residing in the mansion for a maximum of 30 days, counted from the date of the will reading. After that period, the right to use and manage the property would be fully transferred to the primary heirs. 30 days. I read that number over and over, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe an entire life could be compressed into it. 40 years of marriage, tens of thousands of dinners, sleepless nights because a child was sick, because Richard was under pressure at work, because projects were on the verge of collapse. All of it reduced to 30 days, enough time to pack up, enough time to disappear neatly. Lauren was the first to act. Just 3 days later, while I was still trying to keep my routine from completely falling apart, I saw an unfamiliar SUV parked in front of the house. A woman stepped out wearing neutral-colored clothing, a notebook in hand, her eyes quickly scanning the garden. Lauren walked beside her, heels clicking evenly on the stone path, her voice clear and decisive. "The living room walls need repainting. Mom likes this color, but it's too dark. The curtains should be replaced. The light doesn't feel upscale enough. This dining table can stay, but the chairs should be changed." I stood on the front steps, watching them move through the house like two strangers surveying a newly purchased property. No one greeted me. No one asked for my opinion. Lauren glanced at me briefly, offering a thin smile. "I just want everything ready for later, Mom," she said. "You won't be here that long anyway." The words were light, as if she were talking about a short vacation, not about me being erased from the house I had lived in for more than half my life. Evan was no less efficient. The next day, another group arrived. They carried cameras, measuring tools, clipboards. The man in charge introduced himself as an appraiser. Evan shook his hand and talked about interior value, antiques, and the collection Richard had carefully assembled over many years. I watched them open Richard's office door. I heard drawers being pulled open, pens scratching on paper. Evan stood there, pointing things out, explaining as if the place had belonged to him all along, and I was just a guest who hadn't left yet. I moved from room to room, silently like a shadow. Rooms that had once been filled with memories were now called by different names: main living area, common space, potential layout. They were no longer the places where I read every morning, decorated for Christmas, or hosted the children's birthdays. I began hearing familiar phrases, repeated over and over, wrapped in the tone of concern. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll find you a suitable place. You don't need a house this big anymore. You won't have to worry about upkeep so much." Those words weren't wrong, but they were hollow. They sounded like things people say to soothe a child, not to speak to a woman who had lived her entire adult life in this house. No one asked what I wanted. No one asked if I was ready. That evening, after everyone had left, I locked the doors, went upstairs, and entered my bedroom, the room Richard and I had shared for decades. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened my handbag, and took out the phone. It fit neatly in my hand, silent, lifeless. A small object, yet carrying a strange weight. I pressed the power button again, even though I already knew the result. The screen lit up, the wedding photo, 6 empty circles. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my hand from shaking. I tried the familiar passwords again, not because I believed they would work, but because I needed to be certain I hadn't missed something obvious. The day we bought this house, the day Richard signed his first major contract, the address of the small place we lived when we were newly married. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Each incorrect attempt made the phone vibrate softly, then display a message telling me I had to wait a few minutes before trying again. I stared at the screen, feeling as if someone were watching me, judging, measuring, controlling every move. Richard liked control. Not in a tyrannical way, but in the way of someone who believed that if he didn't keep a tight grip on the wheel, everything would crash. I had grown used to it. I had lived in his orbit for so long that I hadn't realized how much of myself had slowly disappeared. But this was different. He was dead. And yet I was still being controlled. I set the phone down on the nightstand, stood up, and walked into the dressing room. Dresses, suits, coats, all hanging neatly in place, but I knew their days in this room were numbered. I opened a drawer and took out a small wooden box. Inside were a few personal items: the ring I wore when we were first married, some old photographs, and a handwritten letter Richard had written to me many years ago after a fight when he didn't know how to apologize. I picked up the letter and reread it, and for the first time since he died, I felt a slow, simmering anger. Not anger over the will, but anger over the silence. Richard had known what the children would do. He was far too intelligent not to see the change in them, and yet he said nothing to me. He let me walk into this situation, pushed aside, treated like a stranger, without a single warning. Or had he spoken, and I simply hadn't listened? The days that followed passed in a haze. Every morning I woke up, went down to the kitchen and made coffee as usual, but the kitchen no longer felt like mine. Lauren had said she would review the design so I didn't dare move anything. Evan had taped notes to several items, marking them keep, sell, appraise. I lived in my own house like a tenant without a lease. Every night I tried unlocking the phone again. I tried new numbers, unfamiliar, combinations. I tried things connected to Richard that only I knew, small, private details that never appeared in files or calendars. Still wrong. The waiting time kept increasing. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes. I began to notice the pattern, and a chill ran down my spine. This was not an ordinary phone. It had been designed to stop me, or anyone, from accessing it too quickly, like a test of patience, or like a door that only opens when the person standing in front of it is truly ready. I didn't know what made me angrier, my children's indifference, or the fact that Richard was still controlling everything from beyond the grave. One afternoon, Lauren walked into the living room while I was reading. She stood there with her arms crossed, her voice awkwardly gentle. "Mom," she said, "Evan and I are looking at a few apartments. There's one that's pretty nice, not too far from here. You'd like it." I looked up at my daughter, at the grown, beautiful, but unfamiliar face. I suddenly realized she wasn't asking whether I wanted to go see it. She was informing me. "We just want you to be comfortable," Lauren added. "You don't really need many things anymore." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to argue. I was tired of explaining who I was in this house. After Lauren left, I sat alone in the room that had once been the center of our family. I looked around at every object, every wall, every small scratch in the wooden floor whose origin only I knew. And for the first time, a clear, sharp thought formed in my mind. Something was wrong. Not just the children's greed, not just the will, but the entire picture. Too smooth, too perfectly arranged, as if I were just a small variable that needed to be removed for everything to function as planned. I went back to the bedroom and picked up the phone again. It was still silent. But this time, I no longer looked at it with desperation. I looked at it with suspicion, and with a slow, deep anger that was beginning to take shape inside me. In the days that followed, the phone began to reveal its true nature. Not just a locked object, but a system designed to push its holder to the very edge. At first, I thought I simply needed a little more patience. But then I realized the rule. Each time I entered the wrong password, the waiting period increased in a calculated way. Not random, not a technical error. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, then 1 hour. The screen displayed the same cold message every time, without any change in tone. "Please try again later." I watched the countdown numbers, feeling as if I were standing before a sealed steel door, with someone silently observing on the other side, recording every reaction. I had never believed in psychological games. Richard was the one who liked those. Multi-layered plans, experiments about people and endurance. I had thought he applied them to partners, to markets, not to me. But now, after he was gone, I understood. Perhaps I had always been part of those tests as well. One morning, after the waiting time had increased to 2 hours because of a single wrong attempt, I set the phone down on the table and realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from anger. The feeling of being controlled, the thing I had accepted for so many years in my marriage, suddenly became unbearable. I decided I had to look for clues, not on the phone, but in the one place Richard always believed no one would truly touch, his private office in the house. The study was at the end of the second-floor hallway where afternoon light always slanted through a large window. It had once been sacred space to Richard. The children rarely entered unless invited. As for me, I had stepped into it hundreds of times, bringing coffee, carrying files, reminding him to eat dinner, but I had never truly been there. I stood in front of the heavy wooden door, placed my hand on the handle, and hesitated for a second. Something in me still treated this as his territory, even though he was gone. Inside, everything was unchanged. The large desk, stacks of files arranged in an order only Richard understood, bookshelves reaching the ceiling. The smell of old paper, leather from the chair, dried coffee lingering in the air. I moved slowly, afraid of disturbing something fragile. I opened each drawer. First drawer, pens, notebooks, business cards. Second drawer, contracts, financial reports. Third drawer, empty, except for an old metal ruler, something I remembered him using when he was young, before everything became digital. Nothing hinted at a password. I pulled out the chair and sat down. It felt strange sitting in the seat Richard had occupied for decades. It was taller, firmer than the chair I was used to. I placed my hand on the desk, touching the small scratches, marks of time, of nights when he pressed his pen down hard in frustration. Memories flooded in without warning. I saw myself more than 30 years ago, young Audrey, standing at a drafting table, pencil in hand, eyes lighting up as ideas formed. I had been an architect, not famous, but good enough to have my own projects, good enough to be respected. I designed small houses, living spaces with natural light, reading corners, places where children could run and play. Then Richard entered my life with bigger maps, bigger numbers, bigger dreams. Dreams he said were ours. "Just put your work on hold for a while," he'd said. "I need you here. The family needs you." That while lasted more than 40 years. I placed a hand over my chest and took a deep breath, not to accuse, but to admit the truth. I had stepped back willingly. I had let my career fade away, trading it for stability for the family, for Richard, for the children. And I had believed, naively, that it would be acknowledged. I stood up and opened the filing cabinet behind the desk. The heavy drawers slid out slowly. I flipped through folders and binders, searching for a sign, a note, a familiar number, anything that could connect to the phone. Nothing. Disappointment rose, but with it came a clearer realization. Richard never left clues in obvious places. He never did. If the password existed, it wasn't on paper. It was in memory, in emotion, in things only one person could reach. I left the study as dusk settled in. Down the hallway, I heard voices and laughter from the living room. Evan and Lauren were there. I hadn't intended to listen, but their voices carried clearly. "She still hasn't packed, has she?" Evan said, irritation in his voice. "She's probably still hoping that phone will save her." Lauren replied, laughing softly. "It's hard to believe Dad left her that thing." Maybe he felt sorry for her. I stood still, my hand against the wall. Each word landed like a slap that didn't require a hand. Not because they were cruel, but because they were unconscious. My children weren't deliberately insulting me. They simply no longer saw me as a person with an inner life, with value. I turned and walked back to my room before they noticed I was there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the steady ticking of the clock. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the phone screen with 6 empty circles. I saw the countdown numbers. I saw my own hand entering the wrong code, over and over again. I sat up at 2 a.m. and picked up the phone, even though I knew I still had to wait. I just wanted it in my hands, as if holding it would give me back some sense of control. But I couldn't control anything at all. The nights that followed were the same. I began suffering from chronic insomnia. During the day, I tried to act normal, but my mind was constantly spinning. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I startled, afraid that Evan or Lauren would walk in and remind me of the 30-day deadline like a silent threat. The phone never left me. I carried it with me when I went into the kitchen, when I sat down to read, when I stepped into the garden. It became part of my body, an invisible weight pressing on my chest, on my thoughts. At times, I wondered if I was imagining too much. Maybe Richard had simply left behind a phone, nothing more. Maybe I was assigning meaning to it because I needed something to cling to. But then I remembered Evan's eyes in the conference room. I remembered the words at the funeral. I remembered how everything had been arranged so neatly, so quickly. No, this wasn't random. Richard was not the kind of man who left things to chance. One night, close to dawn, when I woke again from restless sleep, I sat up, picked up the phone, and looked at it for a long time. I didn't enter a password. I didn't touch the screen. I just looked. And for the first time, I didn't feel despair. I saw a game, a psychological game Richard had started, and whether I wanted to or not, I had been pulled into it. He wanted a reaction. He wanted confusion. He wanted anger. The only question was, why? I set the phone down, stood up, and walked to the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. The palm trees stood silent in the gentle breeze. The house was still asleep. In that dim light, a thought formed slowly but clearly inside me. If this is a game, then I will not quit. And if Richard believed I was strong enough to reach the end, then I will prove him right. The 30th day arrived faster than I expected. That morning I woke very early, even though I had barely slept all night. The pale light of dawn filtered through the bedroom curtains, the room I once thought I would live in until the end of my life. I lay still for a few minutes, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the soft wind slipping through window cracks, the faint creak of wood under someone's footsteps downstairs. Everything felt the same as always, and that was what made it hurt more. I got up and opened the closet. Most of my belongings had been packed into boxes the day before. Lauren had helped me do it, or rather supervised. She stood with her arms crossed, watching me choose what to keep, occasionally offering gentle reminders. "You don't need to take that, Mom. You can leave this one. The new place is small." The new place. A phrase that felt hollow. I took only what was truly necessary. A few simple outfits, some old books, the wooden box of photos, and the phone. The locked phone stayed in my handbag just as it had for weeks. I no longer tried to unlock it every night. The waiting time had grown absurd. I kept it with me only as a reminder that my life did not end here, even if everything around me was trying to prove otherwise. Evan wasn't there that morning. He had gone on a business trip, or at least that was what he said. Lauren walked me to the door. She hugged me quickly, lightly, as if holding on too long might become inconvenient. "Call if you need anything," she said, her voice just gentle enough not to sound cold. "I'm fine," I replied. I stepped outside and stood on the stone steps for one more second. I turned back and looked at the house, the white columns, the garden where I had tended every flower bed, every shrub. 40 years of memories fit perfectly into a single frame, and I had been erased from it in 1 month. No one stood beside me then. The car that took me away, an old sedan Evan had arranged, rolled slowly out of the gate. I didn't look back again. I knew that if I did, I wouldn't be strong enough to go on. The new apartment was less than a 20-minute drive from the mansion, but it felt like another world. The building was old, its gray paint peeling in places. The hallway was narrow, lit by dim yellow lights, smelling of dampness mixed with old food. The elevator creaked as it climbed to the 3rd floor. My apartment had one. Small bedroom, a living room so narrow it barely fit an old sofa and a coffee table. The kitchen was a corner space with a 2-burner electric stove and an old refrigerator that hummed steadily. The window looked out onto the parking lot behind the building, where neon lights reflected off cracked concrete. I stood in the middle of the empty room, suitcase at my feet, and wondered, how did I end up here? Lauren said this place was just enough. I didn't argue. I no longer had the strength to. I set the suitcase down, opened it, and hung a few clothes on the flimsy metal rack. Everything moved slowly, as if my body were trying to adjust to a new rhythm my mind hadn't yet accepted. The allowance Evan promised arrived at the end of the first week, $600. When the bank notification appeared on the ATM screen, I stood there for a long moment. $600 to cover rent, utilities, food, medication. I did the math quickly, a habit from the early days of my marriage to Richard when every dollar mattered. The numbers didn't add up. I started cutting back. First, the medication. I had blood pressure pills I was supposed to take daily. I decided to take them every other day, then once every 2 days. I told myself, I'm fine, it's temporary. Food became simpler too. Bread, canned soup, instant noodles. I ate less. Not because I wasn't hungry, but because I was afraid I would need that money more tomorrow than today. Evenings in the new apartment were quiet in an unpleasant way. There was no rustling wind in the garden, no large clock ticking in the living room. Only the sound of cars in the parking lot, a television from the neighboring unit, and the old refrigerator, humming like an artificial heartbeat. I called Evan in the 2nd week. The phone rang for a long time before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I called Lauren. It rang 5 times, then stopped. I sent a short text. I just wanted to check in. The message was marked as read, but there was no reply. I sat on the old sofa, the phone on the table, watching the screen fade to black. The feeling of abandonment didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, drop by drop, like water leaking through tiny cracks until everything was flooded. In the 3rd week, the allowance dropped to $400. No explanation. Just a new number appearing in my account. I stood at the ATM, receipt in hand, feeling a wave of lightheadedness. I leaned against the wall, took a deep breath, and waited for it to pass. The landlord, a middle-aged man with a protruding belly and a dry voice, began knocking more often. The first time, he reminded me politely. The second time, his tone grew firmer. By the 3rd time, he stood in front of the door with his hands on his hips. "You're late on the rent," he said. "I know," I replied. "I'm waiting for my children to send the money." "I don't care where it comes from," he said. "I just need it in full and on time." When the door closed, I slid down to the floor, my back against the thin wooden door. I closed my eyes, forcing myself not to cry. I didn't want to cry in this apartment. I didn't want this place to witness my collapse. The nights that followed, I slept very little. When I did sleep, I dreamed I was standing in the old mansion, but every door was locked. I held the phone and entered the password, but the numbers dissolved beneath my fingers. I woke up in the dark, heart racing, cold sweat soaking my back. I stopped calling Evan and Lauren, not because I didn't need them, but because I understood. Those calls led nowhere. They only made me feel smaller, weaker. One afternoon, as I counted the remaining money in my wallet, I realized I had hit bottom. Not because I was running out of cash, but because I had started considering things I had never thought about before. Selling my wedding ring, selling sentimental items, even looking for work at my age. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. My face was thinner, my skin duller, my eyes tired. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. That woman was no longer Richard White's wife, no longer the lady of a grand mansion. She was just a tenant trying to survive. That evening, as I sat on the floor with my back against the sofa, the phone in my handbag brushed against my hand. I took it out and placed it on my palm. It was still cold, still silent, still locked. I let out a quiet laugh, a dry laugh, neither happy nor sad. "If this is the lowest point," I whispered, unsure who I was speaking to, "then I'm already here." And in that moment, I understood. There was nothing left to lose. I was in free fall. But sometimes it's only when you hit bottom that you begin to realize you still have the ability to rise. 30 days. That number appeared on the phone screen on a drizzly evening when I entered the wrong password one more time, for the last time. There was no gentle vibration, no familiar countdown notification, just a short, cold, absolute line of text. Device locked for 30 days. I stared at those words for a long time, long enough for the rain outside the window to change rhythm, from light tapping to a steady pour. 30 days, exactly the same amount of time I had once been granted in the mansion. I let out a brief, hollow laugh, then went silent. Not because it was funny, but because I realized I had been cornered into a very narrow space, where there was no room left for vague hope. I set the phone down on the table and turned it face down, as if doing so might lessen its presence. But it was still there, in the room, in my head, in every breath I took. The days that followed passed slowly, sticking together like wet pages. I no longer tried to unlock it. I no longer counted the hours. I knew that no matter what I did, the phone would not respond. And that feeling of absolute rejection, not from a person, but from an inanimate object, exhausted me in a different way. The money in my account dwindled faster than I had expected. I began looking around my small apartment with new eyes, the eyes of someone considering selling off pieces of her life. The first item I placed on the table was a wedding ring. Not the one I had worn for decades. I didn't have the courage for that, but an older, thinner ring I had worn when I was young. I took it to a second-hand shop near the bus station. The man behind the counter examined it with a magnifying glass, turned it over a few times, then named a price. I nodded. I didn't bargain. Next came a few pieces of jewelry, then an old watch, then some rare books I had kept because I thought, I'll reread these someday. Each time I left the shop, it felt as though I had cut away a very small piece of myself. Not enough to cause sharp pain, but enough to leave emptiness. I didn't tell my children. I didn't call. I didn't text. Not because I didn't want them to know, but because I wanted to see whether in the silence they would notice my absence. They didn't. By the 4th week, I had no choice but to call Evan, not to complain, just to ask about the overdue rent. The phone rang longer than ever before. Then voicemail answered, polite and distant. I left a short, neutral message without blame. There was no response. I called Lauren. This time she picked up. Her voice sounded busy. "What is it, Mom?" "I just wanted to ask about this month's money." "Oh, that," Lauren interrupted, her tone softening slightly. "I think you should start figuring things out on your own. We can't support you forever." I held the phone, saying nothing. "I understand," I said at last. "Okay," Lauren replied quickly. "I'm in a meeting." The call ended. I sat still, watching the screen fade to black. There was no burst of anger, no tears, just a cold confirmation. They had fully withdrawn their hands from me. My birthday fell in the middle of that time. I woke up that day like any other. No flowers, no card, no phone call. I made myself a weak cup of coffee and sat by the window watching rain fall on the parking lot. I remembered past birthdays. Richard usually gave me a small, understated gift, a book, a pen, a quiet dinner. This year, there was nothing. I didn't celebrate. I didn't remind anyone. I went out and bought a small cake from a nearby shop. I ate it alone, cutting it into 2 pieces out of old habit, then realizing I only needed one. I put the other piece in the refrigerator, not knowing why. That evening, I sat on the living room floor with my back against the sofa, the phone placed in front of me, locked, silent, like a door that had decided not to open. I closed my eyes. "Are you satisfied now?" I whispered, unsure who I was talking to. If this is a lesson, then I've learned enough. I didn't believe Richard could hear me, but I kept speaking, because there was no one else. "I did everything right, Richard. I stayed. I sacrificed. I trusted you. And now I'm here, alone, without a home, without money, without children." My throat tightened. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "If that phone is what you left for me, then why did you lock it like this?" There was no answer, only the sound of rain outside the window. In the days after my birthday, my body began to react. Sudden dizziness, mornings when I had to sit for a long time before standing up. I knew I couldn't keep cutting my medication like this, but I also didn't know where the money would come from. The landlord came back, this time without knocking. He waited for me in the hallway, arms crossed. "If you don't pay by this week," he said, "I'll send a formal notice." I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I had already used up all those words. That night, I sat on the bed for a long time, staring at the locked phone on the nightstand. I didn't touch it. I just looked. And for the first time, a very dangerous thought appeared. Should I give up? Not giving up in a dramatic sense, but letting go. Accepting that some doors are not meant for me. Accepting that 40 years of living for others have led me to an ending like this. I lay down and turned my face toward the wall. Tears came, but not violently. They were quiet, warm, soaking into the pillow. I didn't try to wipe them away. And then, when I thought I had hit bottom, when everything inside me settled into something close to emptiness, something very small happened. Not on the phone, not from my children, but from me. I suddenly realized that over these past weeks, I had been fighting, not to unlock the phone, but to prove that I deserved to unlock it. I had tried to remember, to guess, to struggle, as if I needed to pass some kind of test in order to be allowed to keep living. That thought made me sit up straight. "No," I said softly, for the first time with a strange certainty. "If this is your game, then I'm not playing by the old rules anymore." I didn't know what that meant. I had no plan, no money, no guarantees, But in that moment, in the middle of the small apartment, in the middle of despair, I felt a very subtle shift, like the air before a heavy storm suddenly thickening. I picked up the phone, not to unlock it, just to hold it. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't beg it. I simply whispered, not like a plea, but like a very quiet challenge. If you still have something to say, then it's time. Outside, the rain stopped. Inside me, something, very slowly, very deeply, began to turn. I don't know why I picked up the phone at that moment. There was no warning sign, no clear thought, just a very light impulse, like when your hand reaches out to catch something that's about to fall before your brain has time to give the command. I sat on the edge of the bed, the room so silent that I could hear the faint metallic sound as my fingernail brushed against the edge of the device. The screen was still black. I pressed the power button. The light came on slowly, unhurried, as if it, too, were deciding whether it should respond to me. The logo appeared, then disappeared. The old photo showed up, the photo of Richard and me taken many years ago on an autumn afternoon. I was younger, my hair longer. He was standing slightly angled toward me, his hand resting on the back of the chair. I had looked at this photo dozens of times over the past weeks. It no longer hurt the way it once had. It was just a memory, frozen in place. The familiar words appeared. Enter passcode. 6 empty circles. I didn't think. I didn't review the numbers I had already tried. I didn't repeat dates, milestones, painful or happy memories. I didn't try to remember. I just let my hand move. My thumb touched the screen, pressed the first number, then the second. A slow, steady rhythm without hesitation. I wasn't counting. I wasn't looking. I was simply following something very deep, very vague, like a memory that didn't live in my head, but in my body. When I pressed the final number, I still didn't look up. Then, very softly, a sound appeared. Not the error tone, not the familiar gentle vibration of rejection, but a small click, almost impossible to hear, like an old lock finally deciding to turn. I lifted my head. The circles lit up. The screen flickered once, and then it opened. For a second, I didn't understand what was happening. I just stared at the screen, my mind empty, my heart pounding so hard I had to place a hand on my chest. I had grown so used to failure that when the opposite happened, my brain couldn't process it in time. It opened. The phone, the thing that had been silent, sealed, cold for weeks, was open in front of me, calmly, without fanfare, as if it had simply been waiting for this exact moment. I didn't touch the screen right away. I was afraid that if I did, it would disappear. I was afraid this was just a glitch, a brief mistake. I breathed slowly until my heartbeat settled, then finally placed my finger on the glass. The home screen appeared. It didn't look like any phone I had ever used. No social media, no news, no entertainment apps. Just a few simple icons arranged neatly. And right in the center, more prominent than all the others, was a folder. The folder was named Audrey. I froze. Not my files, not documents, not some generic label, but my name, my full name. No abbreviation, no explanation. I raised my hand to my mouth, not out of shock, but because of a strange feeling, like someone had just spoken my name out loud in an empty room. I tapped the folder. It opened almost instantly, without delay. Inside was a long list of files. They were numbered neatly from top to bottom. No poetic titles, no explanations, just plain text. File 01, File 02, File 03. I tapped the first file. The screen turned white. A document appeared, clear and sharp. I read the first line and felt the air in the room thicken. Property Ownership Certificate. Owner's name, Audrey White. I blinked, read it again, and again. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a similar name. It was me. The property address was in San Diego, a 4-story commercial building in the downtown area. Estimated value, more than $3 million. I sat completely still. My hands began to shake. Not the kind of shaking from cold, but the kind that comes when your brain is struggling to catch up with what your eyes have just seen. I scrolled down. The signature at the bottom, the notarization, the date. Everything was legal, complete, no room for doubt. I backed out and opened the second file. Another property. This one was an apartment complex in Portland. More than 20 units. Owner's name, Audrey White. Value, nearly $3 million. The third file. An industrial warehouse in Nevada. The fourth file. A commercial plot of land in Arizona. I opened file after file, like someone flipping through a book they didn't realize they had been writing all along. Every page was a direct blow to my old understanding of my own life. Every property was in my name, not joint ownership, not authorization, full ownership. I don't remember how many files I opened. I only know that at some point, my hands were no longer steady enough to hold the phone. I set it down on the bed, then picked it up again, afraid that if I looked away for too long, everything would vanish. I started adding the numbers in my head. 3 million, 2.8 million, 1.4 million, 4.5 million. The numbers stacked on top of each other, crossing 10 million, then 20, then 30. I stopped when I realized I was no longer clear-headed enough to continue. More than $40 million. Not on paper promises, not future possibilities, but real assets, real properties, things that still existed out there, still generating income, still standing firm. While I had been sitting in this small apartment, eating dry bread and counting every dollar, I leaned back, my spine against the headboard. The ceiling slowly spun above me. I closed my eyes, not to avoid seeing, but to feel. Richard had done this. Not in 1 year, not in 2, but over many years. Some of the properties had been purchased 8 or 9 years earlier. There were notes about rental income, cash flow, regular deposits. Everything had been recorded carefully, quietly, without display, like an underground current existing alongside the life I thought I knew. I opened the phone again and scrolled further down. A summary table appeared. Income being transferred regularly into a bank account. Account holder's name, Audrey White. I had never opened that account, but the signatures, the paperwork, everything was mine. I laughed, not a joyful laugh, but a laugh released from overwhelming shock. I pressed a hand to my forehead, feeling a dull ache behind my eyes. I took a deep breath, trying to stay conscious. I whispered, my voice rough. What did you do, Richard? The pieces began to fall into place, slowly but firmly. His coldness in the final years, the way he avoided questions when I asked about finances, how he always said, "You don't need to worry." I had thought it was control, patriarchy, the habit of a man who didn't want to share power. I was wrong. Or at least, I had only seen half the truth. Richard had been preparing for a long time. Not for the children, but for me. Not in the way I expected, not with words or a clear will, but with a silent plan, patient, cruel enough to force me to hit bottom before I could stand up. I didn't know whether to be angry with him or grateful to him. Probably both. I picked up the phone again, this time my hands no longer shaking as before. I swiped the screen and looked again at the folder bearing my name. It wasn't a gift. It was a return of something I had lost long ago, the right to have my name on my own life. Outside the window, the parking lot was still wet from the earlier rain. The neon lights still reflected on cracked concrete. Nothing outside had changed, but inside me, something had shifted. I was no longer the woman who had been pushed out of her home, living on a trickle of allowance, begging for unanswered calls. I was still in this apartment, still wearing old clothes, still unable to afford a proper meal. But I knew, and knowing alone was enough for the world to begin turning in a different direction. I sat for a long time in front of the open screen, pale blue light reflecting off the low ceiling of the apartment. The numbers, the text, the documents were still there, but I didn't open any more files. I knew I wasn't ready yet. The dizziness hadn't fully passed, as if I had just stepped out of a dark room and my eyes hadn't adjusted to the light. In the lower corner of the screen, there was an icon I hadn't touched yet. A small, simple icon, not as prominent as the folder with my name, a voice recording app. I knew what it was even before opening it. My finger hovered in the air. I realized I was hesitating in a way that felt very familiar. Just like the times I stood outside Richard's office, hand on the doorknob but not turning it, afraid of what waited on the other side. I took a deep breath, then touched the screen. The list was short, only one recording. The file name wasn't elaborate. No date, no note. Just a simple line, like his voice when he no longer wanted to explain things to anyone. For Audrey. I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened them, my finger was already resting on the play button. There was a brief moment of silence, then a soft breath, a faint rustling sound like someone adjusting a chair, and then his voice came through. Not the voice he used in meetings, not the hard, steady tone he used with partners, but Richard's voice when it was just the two of us, when he was tired, when he didn't need to pretend to be strong. Audrey. Just hearing my name once like that made me bite my lip to keep from crying. I hadn't heard him say my name that way in a very long time. If you're listening to this, he continued slowly, then it means I'm no longer there to say this to you in person. I set the phone down on the bed, but kept my hand on it, as if afraid the voice would disappear if I let go. I imagine you're very angry right now, he said. Maybe you think I'm cruel. Maybe you think I betrayed you in some way. He paused, his breathing heavier. You have every right to think that. I let out a silent laugh, a faint, bitter curve of the lips. Angry? I had already passed that stage. What I felt now wasn't sharp. It was deep and heavy, like a stone pressing against my chest. I'm sorry, Richard said without detouring this time. I'm sorry I let you suffer. I'm sorry I didn't tell you beforehand. I'm sorry I made you feel abandoned. I closed my eyes. His words fell slowly, not rushed, as if each sentence had been carefully chosen. I know these past months would be hell for you, he said. I know the children would treat you coldly. I know you would have to leave the house you considered your life. I know you would begin to doubt yourself. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. He knew. He had known, and he let it happen anyway. I didn't do this to punish you, his voice lowered. I did this because I believe that without that fall, you would never truly see. I shook my head slightly, as if he could see me. See what clearly? I had already seen more than enough. I've watched our children for many years, Richard continued. I kept convincing myself they just needed time, that they would mature, that they would learn gratitude. He let out a very soft laugh, short and tired. I was wrong, and that was my greatest mistake. His voice dropped even lower, carrying an admission I had never heard from him when he was alive. I taught them how to make money, he said, but I never taught them how to value people, especially you." I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to argue, to say that he shared responsibility for that he had let me step back for far too long. But I stayed silent. I let him speak. "I know that if I had told you about those assets while I was still alive," he continued, "I know exactly what you would have done." He didn't need to say more. I knew. I had always known. I would have suggested sharing them with the children. I would have worried. I would have questioned whether I deserved them. I would have once again put other people's needs first. "I couldn't let that happen," Richard said, "not because I didn't trust you, but because I trusted you too much." I laughed, this time out loud, a small, fractured sound. "I needed you to see them with nothing left to hide," he said. "I needed you to see who Evan and Lauren truly are, not through the role of a self-sacrificing mother, but with your own eyes." He paused. The silence stretched longer. When he spoke again, his voice was slow and firm. "That phone was not a joke, Audrey. It wasn't a memory test. It was a door." I held my breath. "The passcode isn't in dates," he said. "It's not in numbers anyone could guess. It's in the place you abandoned a long time ago." I remembered the moment my hand had moved on its own, without thought. A memory not stored in my head, but in my body. I understood. "The day that phone opens," he continued, "won't be the day you become rich. It will be the day you become free." His voice softened, the way it used to late at night, when the world outside had gone to sleep. "I set that timing to coincide with your 70th birthday," he said, "not because of the number, but because I wanted you to step into the next part of your life as yourself." 70 years old. I looked down at my hands, the wrinkles, the age spots. I had thought 70 was the end, a period, a closing chapter. Richard had thought differently. "I know you'll be angry," he said, his voice heavier, "and you have every right to be. I accept that, but I hope that when the anger fades, you'll understand that I did this because I believed in you more than anyone." I raised my hand to cover my mouth. Tears fell, not in a rush, but quietly, like water finally finding a way out. "That phone," he said, "is not something I left for you." I shook my head slightly. "It's something I returned to you." His breathing sounded one last time, then the recording ended. The screen fell silent. My small room sank into stillness, broken only by distant cars in the parking lot. I sat there for a long time. I didn't replay the recording. I didn't open any more files. I let his words settle, little by little, like sediment sinking in a glass of water after being stirred too hard. I was angry, and I understood. Angry that he had let me go hungry, humiliated, alone. Angry that he had decided for me once again, even if his intentions were good. But I was also awake now. I had seen my children clearly, more clearly than ever before. And without those months, I might have gone on deceiving myself. I picked up the phone and placed it neatly on the table. I didn't call anyone. I didn't announce anything. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't tell Evan. I didn't tell Lauren. I didn't even call a lawyer. I chose silence, not out of fear, but because for the first time in my life, I understood that silence could be an active choice, not submission. I didn't need them to know what I now knew. Not yet. I stood up and opened the window. Cool night air flowed in. I took a deep breath and felt my chest open. Somewhere inside me, something had ended, and something else, very slowly, very steadily, was beginning. I remained by the window long after the recording ended, not because I needed more air, but because I needed time to accept that what I had just heard was real. Richard was gone, but he hadn't vanished. He had only changed the way he existed, from a man of flesh and bone into a chain of carefully calculated decisions, revealing themselves layer by layer. When I returned to the table, the phone was still there, quiet, as if it had never kept me awake night after night. The screen was dark, but I knew that inside it an entire world was waiting for me to step in. I touched it lightly to wake it again, not out of curiosity, but because something Richard had said wouldn't let go of me. You are never alone. If not the children, then who? I opened the contacts. The list was so short it made me freeze. Not 10 numbers, not 5, just one name, Thomas Reed. No photo, no notes, just a name and a phone number with a familiar California area code. I repeated the name in my mind, and old memories began to stir. Thomas Reed, Richard's close friend, a man I had met only a few times at polite, obligatory dinners, quiet, always impeccably dressed, never flashy, a lawyer, but without the coldness I had seen in others in that world. Thomas always kept his distance, courteous, but his eyes were constantly observing, like he saw things others overlooked. Richard rarely spoke about him. Only one sentence repeated whenever I asked about complicated legal decisions. Thomas is the man I trust most. I stared at the number for a long time. Call or don't call? Part of me wanted to remain silent, to keep this secret to myself just a little longer, like a small flame newly lit. I was afraid that opening the door too soon would let the wind blow it out. But another part of me, the part learning to stand upright again, understood that I couldn't do everything alone. Not now. I pressed call. The ringing sounded steady, unhurried. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3. I almost thought no one would answer. Then, on the 4th ring, a deep, warm male voice came through. Audrey. Not hello, not who's calling, but my name, spoken as if he had been waiting for this call for a very long time. I swallowed. You are Thomas Reed? Yes, he said. I've been waiting for you. Not waiting. Waiting. Those words are different, and Thomas knew that. I'm not sure where to begin, I said. You don't need to, he replied. Richard told me this call would come at the right time. I closed my eyes. You know everything? I know what I need to know, Thomas said calmly, and I know what you've been through. I didn't explain. I didn't complain. There was no need. He didn't ask, and I didn't want to speak. There was a strange, shared understanding in that conversation, as if any explanation would be redundant. The assets on the phone, they're all real? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Completely real, Thomas replied without hesitation. All documents are legal, notarized, carefully managed, and most importantly, everything is in your name. I took a deep breath. And the cash flow? Still running, he said, for many years now. I leaned back in my chair. The small apartment suddenly felt so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. How much? I asked, my voice softer. Thomas paused briefly, as if choosing his words carefully so I wouldn't be overwhelmed. In addition to the property value, he said slowly, you currently have a little over $6 million in cash across linked accounts. That amount comes from rental income, conservative investments, and reinvested profits over many years. I said nothing. Not because I didn't believe him, but because my body needed a few seconds to understand that I was no longer living day to day in survival mode. Richard was very careful, Thomas continued. He didn't allow anyone, not even the children, to access this information. Why did he trust you so much? I asked. Thomas gave a very small smile, not a happy one. Because I was the only person who ever told him that. If he didn't change, he would lose you. That sentence stunned me. Richard wasn't someone who took advice easily, Thomas went on, but he listened to me on that point, even if it was late. I looked around my apartment, the place where the landlord had knocked so many times demanding rent. I'm about to be evicted, I said, allowing my voice to weaken for the first time in the call. I know, Thomas said, and that won't happen. I held my breath. Right after you hang up, he continued, I'll transfer enough to cover all outstanding rent, plus the next 3 months. Your landlord will receive the money within 24 hours. You don't have to, I began. This isn't help, Thomas interrupted gently. This is your right. I'm just the one carrying it out. I closed my eyes. The pressure in my chest, the weight that had sat there for weeks, suddenly eased. But there is one thing, Thomas said. Richard was very clear about this. I opened my eyes. What is it? You can't act publicly, he said. Not yet. You don't tell the children. You don't tell the family lawyer. You don't tell anyone except me. I understood immediately. Until my birthday, I said. That's right, Thomas replied. He wanted everything to happen at the right time. I let out a small smile. That was always him. Thomas was silent for a moment. And he wanted you to have time to prepare, he said. Not with paperwork, but with yourself. After the call ended, I sat still for a long time. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was feeling a very slow, very deep shift. Not explosive joy, but steadiness returning. Something I had lost far longer ago than I realized. I began to prepare, quietly. No luxury shopping, no moving. I simply started caring for the basic things I had neglected. I took my medication regularly again. I ate full meals. I walked every morning around the neighborhood, letting the early sunlight touch my skin. I bought a few new outfits, not expensive, but well-fitting, neat. I looked at myself in the mirror a little longer, not to find flaws, but to become reacquainted with myself. With each passing day, I felt my back straighten, my steps grow steadier, my eyes no longer avoided other people's gazes. I still lived in that apartment. I still walked through the narrow hallway, still greeted the elderly neighbor next door. No one knew what had changed, and I liked it that way. The secret was no longer a burden. It became a support, and for the first time in many years, I was no longer waiting for anyone to define my worth. I was preparing, not for revenge, not for display, but to step into the next part of my life as myself, Audrey White, the keeper of the secret. Big changes sometimes don't arrive with explosions, but with quiet tremors spreading beneath surfaces that seem solid. I realized that one ordinary morning while making coffee in the small kitchen, the phone vibrated on the table. Not a message from Thomas, not a bank notification, but an incoming call from Evan's number. I stared at the screen for a long time. When was the last time Evan had called me? I searched my memory and realized I could no longer remember clearly. During the months I struggled, the calls had always been from me and rarely answered. And now, my eldest son's name appeared, like a wrong note in a familiar melody. I didn't answer right away. I let the phone ring for a few more beats, not out of spite, but to listen to myself. I wanted to know what I was feeling, not anger, not anticipation, just clarity. When I finally picked up, Evan's voice came through almost immediately, fast and urgent. "Mom, are you okay?" A very simple question, but the way he asked it wasn't simple at all. His voice no longer carried its usual sharpness, no longer rushed toward an ending. There was a clear tension in it, as if he were trying to stay calm while something inside him was already cracking. "I'm fine," I said briefly. There was a pause. Evan cleared his throat. "Mom, where are you right now?" "At home," I said. I didn't say apartment. I didn't say rental. I just said home. And I knew Evan would interpret that however he wanted. "Oh, that's good," Evan said quickly. I wanted to check on you." I didn't reply. I let the silence do its work. I had learned that sometimes silence makes people reveal more than any question ever could. "Mom," Evan continued, lowering his voice, "the company has been having some trouble lately." I watched, the steam rise from my coffee cup and dissolve into the air. "Is that so?" I asked evenly. "Yeah," Evan exhaled. "Some older projects. Ran into issues. A few loans came due that we didn't expect." I didn't sound surprised, not because I already knew, though I did, but because I understood this wasn't the moment to react. "Lauren's been really stressed too," Evan added, as if layering weight onto the story. "She hasn't slept much these past few nights." "Is that right?" I said. Evan went quiet again. I imagined him standing in Richard's old, spacious office, phone in hand, staring at some blank patch of wall where awards and framed photos used to hang with pride. "Mom," Evan said, slower this time, "we thought maybe you should know what's going on." I smiled very slightly. "No." A word that sounded considerate, but beneath it lay a very familiar probing. "What do you think I could help with?" I asked. Evan hesitated. Just a brief moment, but enough for me to hear the panic slipping through the cracks of his carefully controlled voice. "I mean, you were Dad's wife," Evan said. "Maybe there are things Dad left behind that we don't fully understand." I set my coffee down. "The will was read," I said. "You remember that, don't you?" "I do," Evan replied quickly. "But the lawyer said there are still some complex clauses, financial structures. Dad was always very discreet." I didn't answer right away. In my mind, Richard's voice echoed from the recording. I needed you to see them with nothing left to hide, and here it was. "Did you call to check on me?" I asked calmly, "or to ask about money?" Evan inhaled sharply. "Mom, it's okay," I interrupted, still composed. "I just want to know what we're talking about." On the other end of the line, Evan said nothing for a few seconds. Then his voice changed completely. No more circling. "The company is in danger," Evan said. "The debt is bigger than we thought. If we don't fix this in time, we could lose everything." I closed my eyes briefly, not out of heartbreak, but because I could now see with absolute clarity the picture Richard had drawn long before. "And you think I have the answers?" I said. "I think you might have information," Evan replied. Dad trusted you." A very good line, and a very late one. The call ended shortly after. Evan didn't ask outright. He kept a polite distance, as if he didn't dare cross the final line yet. But I knew. The door had opened. No one had pushed it fully, but it was no longer closed. That afternoon, Lauren called. Unlike Evan, her voice was softer, almost pleading. "Mom," she said, stretching the word the way she used to. "How have you been? Are you eating properly?" I leaned back in my chair. Pretended concern. Richard had been right. When money becomes a problem, concern returns very quickly. "I'm fine," I said. "Thank you." "I know." "We haven't been around much," Lauren said, her voice trembling slightly. "But everything happened so fast. We were under a lot of pressure, too." pressure because of money," I said, not as an accusation, but as a statement. Lauren fell silent. Then she sighed. "Mom, the company is in really bad shape." I didn't respond. "Do you remember Dad ever mentioning private investment funds?" Lauren asked, "or accounts he didn't put under the corporation?" I looked out the window. The sunlight that day was pale, neither harsh nor sad. An ordinary day, something I hadn't had in months. "I don't remember," I said, and it was true in a very precise way. I didn't remember. I knew. Lauren went on for a while longer, more than Evan, more emotional, but the substance was the same. Panic wrapped in gentle words, fear hidden behind the word family. When the call ended, I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel burdened. I just felt clear, clearer than ever. The corporation Richard left behind, the thing my children had proudly taken over like a trophy, was beginning to reveal its true face. Old loans, over-budget projects, financial commitments built on the assumption that everything would keep expanding forever. Richard had left them a large ship, but he had also left it with a hull full of cracks. And now, as water began to pour in, Evan and Lauren panicked and turned back to look for the person they had abandoned on shore. I sat there in my small apartment, listening to the ticking of the wall clock. Each passing second was a tiny shift in the balance of power. I didn't call back. I didn't text. I didn't promise anything. I didn't act distant either. I simply observed. I observed the way my children's voices trembled when they mentioned money, the speed with which they remembered me once things began to fall apart, the way, "How are you, Mom?" was followed almost immediately by, "Do you remember what Dad said?" And in that observation, I fully understood the lesson Richard had wanted to teach, not to punish our children, but to let me see myself and my true place in this story. I didn't reveal the secret, not because I feared losing leverage, but because I knew that when truth is spoken too early, it loses its weight. The balance had shifted, and this time I didn't need to do anything at all. I only needed to stand firm. That morning, I woke up before the alarm went off, not because I was anxious, but because my body had grown used to waking early over the past weeks. Light slipped through the curtains, soft and clear, without the heaviness that used to accompany mornings. I got up, made tea, and drank it slowly, letting the warmth spread through my throat. Today was my birthday. 70 years old. I put on the dark blue dress I had chosen a few days earlier. Not elaborate, not showy, but fitting in a way that surprised me. I looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual, not to search for signs of age, but to recognize something that had changed in my eyes. They no longer avoided. They were steady, direct, and clear. Thomas Reed's office was in an old building downtown, not flashy like the glass towers where Richard used to work, but solid and quiet. When I stepped inside, the scent of old wood and paper reminded me of libraries from long ago, places people went to find truth, not to display power. Thomas stood when I entered. He smiled, subtle and restrained. "Happy birthday, Audrey," he said. "Thank you," I replied. My voice sounded calm, as if today were just another ordinary day. But I knew beneath that calm, something was surging. Evan and Lauren were already there. Both sat on the opposite side of the long table next to the family lawyer. Evan looked more worn than the last time I'd seen him. Tie loosened, dark circles under his eyes. Lauren maintained her usual polished appearance, but her hands on the table kept tightening and releasing, an uncontrollable habit. When I sat down, no one spoke. I noticed my children's gazes had changed. The quiet contempt was gone, But it wasn't respect yet either. It was caution, the kind that appears when people are no longer sure they hold the advantage. Thomas opened his briefcase. "Let's begin," he said evenly. "Today, according to Richard White's instructions, the remaining asset structure will be fully disclosed." Evan leaned forward. Lauren held her breath. "For many years," Thomas continued, "Richard White built two parallel systems of assets, one public, the corporation you are currently managing, and one independent, privately managed." He slid the first folder toward me. "All properties listed here, commercial buildings, rental apartment complexes, industrial warehouses, are owned by Audrey White." Lauren let out a very small sound. Evan froze, his eyes locked on the pages. Thomas went on. "The current estimated value of this real estate portfolio is over $40 million. The air in the room thickened. I didn't look at my children. I looked at the edge of the table where light reflected in a thin, straight line. I focused on my breathing, steady, unhurried. Thomas placed a second folder down. In addition, linked accounts, including accumulated cash from rental income and conservative investments, currently total over $6 million. Evan swallowed hard. Lauren raised a hand to cover her mouth, then lowered it, as if afraid of appearing weak. "And this," Thomas said calmly, "is the final part." He opened the thickest folder. "An independent investment structure established many years ago. Current estimated value, approximately $68 million. Sole owner, Audrey White." There was no sigh, no protest, only a heavy silence dropping straight onto the table. "Altogether," Thomas concluded, "the total value of the assets under Audrey White's name exceeds $110 million, with no associated debt." Lauren shook her head slowly. "No, that can't be," she said, her voice breaking. Dad never told us anything." Thomas looked straight ahead. "He told me." Evan turned toward me. For the first time, I saw not just fear in my son's eyes, but a very naked question. "Mom," Evan said, "how long have you known about this?" "Since I needed to know," I replied. "Then, you'll help us, right?" Evan said quickly, as if afraid I might have time to think. "The company is on the edge, just a small part." I raised my hand, not high, not forcefully. Evan stopped. "Before we talk about money," I said, my voice sounding clearer than I expected, "I want to talk about something else." I looked at each of my children in turn. "Over the past months when I had nothing in my hands, how did you treat me?" Lauren lowered her head. Evan stayed silent. "I'm not saying this to accuse," I continued. "I'm saying it so we can look at it honestly. I was forced out of my home. My allowance was cut. My calls went unanswered. And today, when you call me family, what is it for?" "Because you're our mother," Lauren said, her voice trembling. "No," I said softly, "because you're afraid." The words weren't sharp, but they were deep enough to cut. Evan stood up abruptly. "Mom, Dad didn't want things to turn out this way." "Your father did want this," I interrupted, my tone still calm, "and now it's my turn to want something." I stood up, not to leave, but to finish speaking. "I spent my whole life believing that sacrifice was love, that silence was connection. Today, I end that illusion." Lauren broke down, crying. Evan gripped the edge of the table. "I will not save the corporation," I said, "not out of revenge, but because if I do, this lesson will lose its meaning." "Then, what do you want us to do?" Evan asked hoarsely. "Stand up," I replied, "on your own 2 feet." I looked at Thomas, then at the family lawyer. "All necessary procedures have already been prepared," I said. From here on, my assets will be managed the way I choose. I turned back to my children. If one day you come to me not for money, but for respect, we can talk. But today, this conversation ends here. No one stopped me as I walked out. No one called after me. The hallway was long, light slanting in through tall windows. I walked slowly but steadily. Outside, the city was as noisy as ever. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. There were no fireworks, no applause. But inside me, there was a calm I had never known before. 70 years old, I walked out not as someone who had been forgiven, but as someone who had chosen her own path. And this time, I did not look back. I didn't return to that small apartment for long. Not because I was ashamed of the months I had lived there, but because I understood this. Some places exist only to teach us a lesson, then quietly close when their purpose is fulfilled. I left on a pale, sunny morning, carrying very little with me. No large suitcase, no sense of escape, just a natural transition, like leaving a room you've stayed in too long to open a door into a different space. The first thing I did wasn't to buy a new house or travel, as many people might imagine. I reopened my architecture studio. The office was on the second floor of an old building, near a small park where older people often sat reading newspapers at noon. The sign was simple, just my name. No slogan, no advertisement. When I hung it up, my hands trembled slightly, not from fear of failure, but because I was touching a part of myself that had been neglected for far too long. On the first day, no clients came. I wiped down the desk, organized old drawings, rehung a few sketches from years ago. The familiar lines made me smile. I remembered what it felt like to create, to decide, to make mistakes and correct them with my own hands, not as someone's wife, someone's mother, but as Audrey White, an architect. Then the first clients arrived, an older couple who wanted to renovate the home they had lived in for 30 years. They didn't want anything grand, just easier movement, more light. I listened to them carefully, not for the money, but because I understood that feeling, the desire to live the rest of your life in a space that truly belongs to you. Work came slowly, but steadily. I chose projects. I declined what didn't fit. I worked at my own pace, morning walks, simple lunches, evenings spent reading or listening to old music. No one rushed me. No one controlled me. My children's lives were different. The corporation Richard left behind didn't collapse immediately, but it was no longer the solid ship it once was. Evan had to sell off assets. Lauren went back to study management. They started over, not easily, not gloriously. We didn't talk much, but I knew that for the first time in their lives, they were living by their own choices, not leaning on their father's shadow or their mother's sacrifice. I don't resent them. I don't cling to them either. Everyone has their own journey. I had finished mine as the self-sacrificing mother. I wasn't going back to that role, not because I didn't love my children, but because I had learned that love does not mean losing yourself. The old phone now sits on my desk. I no longer use it, but I don't put it away. It has become a symbol, not of money, but of awakening. Every time I see it, I remember the woman who once sat in a cramped apartment, frightened, abandoned, yet still standing. And I am grateful to that woman, 70 years old. I don't call it starting over. I call it returning. Returning to myself, to my ability to choose, to a freedom that came late but fully. I live more slowly now, but more deeply. Fewer people, but more honestly. No roles, no obligations to prove anything to anyone. If you are listening to this story and feel something stir inside you, I want to say this. It is never too late to ask the questions, who am I and who am I living for? If you'd like, tell me where you're listening from. Leave a comment. No need to be long, just honest. If this story brought you comfort, please like, subscribe, and stay with me for the stories ahead. Thank you for listening, for walking with me, and for giving me the chance to tell the journey of finding my way back to myself.